Got your Bible, go ahead and open up to Genesis chapter 13. Genesis 13 is where we will be working from this morning. We're going to spend our time talking about Lot and his move to Sodom and draw some lessons for us as we seek to live faithful to God today and want to learn from the lessons and errors that some have made in the past. And this was certainly a turning point in Lot's life and in his family's walk. So you're in chapter 13, but let me give you some of the backdrop to it. In chapter 12, Abram was called to depart from Ur of the Chaldees, and he was going to go to a land that God had promised him. He didn't know where the land was, just he was following what God told him to do. And among those that traveled with him was his nephew Lot. Chapter 12, verse 4 and 5 talk about Lot being with him. And midway through Genesis chapter 12, they go down to Egypt because there's a famine in the land of Canaan where they're sojourning, and so they go down to Egypt. At the beginning of chapter 13, Abram, Lot, and their families come up out of Egypt, and they journey to Bethel. Trouble started to arise between their herdsmen. These men both have large flocks and herds, plenty of animals, and therefore they've got men who are taking care of them. And so trouble arises, there's strife between their herdsmen because there's just simply not enough land to support both of them when they dwell together. And so they're fighting over pasture, fighting over area in order to feed the animals. And so rather than have strife between them, Abram suggests that they part ways. It's not that he's upset with Lot. He wants them to continue to have an amicable relationship. And so it makes sense that we part ways, and you go your way and I'll go my way, and that way the land will sustain us. And so given the choice, Lot took the fertile land which was in the valley, and that left the rugged mountain range for the aged Abram. And this was a decision that I suspect Lot would eventually regret. It would be a long time, I think, before he would regret it, before he would see why it was a wrong decision. But nonetheless, a decision that Lot would and should regret. There's four things that we're going to focus on today. First of all, we're going to notice Lot's focus on the physical attributes of the land rather than on spiritual consequences that might come from his choice. And then secondly, after Lot selected the plain of Jordan, his tent got increasingly closer to Sodom, which is problematic. And then eventually he moved right into the city of Sodom itself, which is somewhat strange for a shepherd. Not that many fields inside the cities, and then the fourth thing that we will note is that he barely escaped when Sodom was destroyed. And some of his family did not escape. And thus, a decision that certainly should be regretted. But let's start with the first thing, and that's simply that his focus was on physical things, not on spiritual things. So why did Lot choose the plain of Jordan? He looked at it and it just, it looked beautiful. And not only beautiful, like there's green everywhere. And that's what the animals need, is green everywhere. But his focus was on these physical benefits rather than the spiritual consequences. He chose what was easy rather than what was difficult. He chose what was smooth rather than that which was rugged. He chose what was lush rather than that which was sparse. And there's nothing wrong in and of itself to select that which is easy, smooth, and lush. That in itself is not necessarily bad. As a shepherd, he chose the more desirable location. Absolutely. If you have a choice between going and walking in fields and fields and fields, or walking around in a mountainous region that has rocks everywhere, as a shepherd, that sounds a lot better over there, the nice fields to walk in. It would afford the best opportunity to feed and to grow his flock. And so certainly from that perspective, we understand his decision. But as we think about the decision, there are some problems with it. And the first thing that sticks out is that it was selfish. Lot was thinking about himself. Now, again, as a business decision, this may have seemed like the obvious choice. Why would I want to walk around the mountains and then have to go searching for places for my animals to feed when I could just go here and there's just so much for them to feed upon out here? As a business decision, it certainly was the obvious choice. But this was not merely a business decision, or at least it shouldn't have been just a business decision. He had journeyed this far with his uncle Abram. He had been journeying with this man for years. Presumably he loves this man, and we know that Abram loves him. But Abram is an elderly man. They've been together from Ur to Haran, and Haran to Canaan, and down into Egypt and back up. And Abram has watched out for him and cared for him. And in fact, that's even evidenced Abram's care for Lot in that he let Lot make the decision. You go whichever way you want to go, and I'll go the opposite way. And so Lot chooses the easy and the smooth and the lush terrain for himself, which means that he left his elderly uncle to go climb around in the mountains looking for sufficient grazing land for his flock. Now think about that. We've seen that kind of thing before happen, maybe not on this scale, but you get into you're in a busy bus. All the seats are taken, elderly person comes onto the bus, and the teenagers won't get up and let the elderly person sit down in the seat. That is, in essence, what has happened here. Philippians chapter 2 at verse 3, the Apostle Paul writes this: "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others." Let me ask the question, how was Lot looking out for his uncle Abram? I'll take this nice green flat area over here, uncle. You go climb the mountains with your sheep. He wasn't. Who did he esteem better, himself or Abram? Abram esteemed Lot better. That's why he put it forth to him, you choose. Whichever way you go, I'll go the opposite. That's selflessness. But then in response, what we find from Lot is selfishness. When somebody cuts up the pie and they give you the option to take the first piece, how many take the biggest piece of pie? That just doesn't seem like the right thing to do, does it? If they put it on our plate and they gave it to us, that's one thing. But if we're given the option, we don't do that. We understand that there's something uncouth about that. And so how does he show respect and honor for this aged family member when he goes and sends him off to the mountains to climb around for the rest of his life? It doesn't sit well. But not only was Lot's selection selfish, but again, it was purely focused on the physical. It was all about prosperity. It was about the carnal things of life, not about spiritual things. He did not take into account his spiritual life or that of his family. You remember in Luke chapter 12, Jesus told a parable to emphasize that life is not about the abundance of the things that one possesses. In Luke chapter 12, starting at verse 16, I'm just going to read the parable that he gives. He says, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Did you notice how much this rich fool was focused on himself? Hey, I've had a really, really good year. I've got so much increase from my fields that I just don't have enough room to store my crops. And you know, we would hope that maybe the first thought is, who can I help? But that's not what the thought was. As you read through the text, he uses the word I or my 9 times. See, these are my crops, and I'll tear down my barns and build myself greater barns, and me. Everything's about him. In fact, he even had a conversation with himself to affirm his decision. Everything was about him. I wonder how many I's and my's were involved in Lot's decision. See how pretty that land is? I like that. That would be very good for my herd and my flock. And I'm going to be very prosperous there with my family. And Uncle Abram, hi. There's no focus on anyone but himself in the decision. But then it was also void of spiritual insight, just as this man in Luke chapter 12, completely void of spiritual insight and foresight. Jesus' lead-in statement to the parable was this: Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. You remember the occasion, what had taken place, right? Jesus was teaching. He was teaching God's word. He was dealing with spiritual things, and this man was just waiting for Jesus to pause for a moment so he could interject himself and say, Lord, tell my brother to share the inheritance with me. The guy wasn't even listening to what Jesus was saying. He was there for one purpose, and that was, I'm not being treated well by my brother. I need my part of the inheritance. And Jesus wasn't there to deal with the inheritance. He was there to teach. And so your life does not consist in the abundance of the things that you possess. Physical things and the attainment of wealth is certainly not the purpose of life. Solomon tested all that. Remember back in the book of Ecclesiastes, he tested those things and he found that they were worthless. Over and over, that this is futility. But he came to the conclusion, fear God and keep his commandments, because this is man's all. All that other stuff is fluff. This is the purpose. Fear God and keep his commandments. And so after Jesus gave the parable, then he stated this: do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will put on. Life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Focus on spiritual things. Again, with Lot, there was no focus on the spiritual, so far as I can tell in his decision. But we need to consider the spiritual implications of decisions that we make. So if we take a job that keeps us from being able to assemble with the body of Christ, which affects our ability to obey God's command to be with one another and to worship him and to partake of the Lord's Supper and so on and so forth, it's going to affect our spiritual growth. It will affect our influence on others. How can we expect others to take us seriously when we talk about how important God is when we demonstrate God not to be important in things we do? And so we need to be careful about decisions we make, that our decision is going to benefit us and others spiritually. If we make decisions that place our family in the direct line of sinful activities and influences, we've made a bad decision. Lot made a bad decision. We're going to talk a little bit more about the circumstance he put his family in a bit. But we need to be sure we don't put finances above faith. Don't put profits before prayers, and consider spiritual consequences when we're making decisions. So he chooses to go down to the plain. Genesis 13 and verse 12, it says, Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. He chooses the plain of Jordan because of its grazing potential, but soon we find that he makes his way to the cities. And worse yet, eventually to Sodom itself. Now, a visit into town from time to time for the trade of goods and services, that is understandable that a shepherd might do that. But there is no valid reason for a shepherd to take up residence in the city. That doesn't make any sense. Now, I'm not going to assume or infer any kind of evil agenda on Lot's part here. I don't know the thought process that led him to go and do that. But I will say this, that he did get his feet on the wrong path here. Over in Proverbs chapter 4 and at verse 14, Solomon writes this. He says, do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it. Do not travel on it. Turn away from it and pass on. For they do not sleep unless they have done evil, and their sleep is taken away unless they make someone fall. I'm not sure that Solomon could have been any more emphatic about this than what he was. Do not enter, do not walk, avoid, do not travel, turn away, pass on, stay away from this. You don't want to be there. Why should we avoid walking on the path of wicked and the way of evil? Because we need to be careful about the influence that'll have. And when Lot moved his tent closer and closer to Sodom and dwelt in the cities in the plain, he was moving himself closer and closer to wickedness. And I'm not saying that he was drawn to the wickedness per se. I don't know. I'm not in Lot's brain. But I know that it was an unwise decision. The fact is that no one's immune to evil and the influence that it has. Maybe Lot thought, I'll be fine to go into the cities of the plains and into Sodom itself. It's not going to affect me. I believe in God, and I'll be okay. You know what the Apostle Paul would say to that? Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 12. For us to walk into a situation comforting ourselves thinking, I'll be okay. I know it's a bad situation. I know things evil are going on there, but I'll be okay. I won't be affected by it. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. We need to be cautious about the influence that we allow in our lives. Over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and at verse 21 beginning, Paul says this, test all things, hold fast what is good, abstain from every form of evil. Now may the God of peace himself sanctify you completely, and may your whole spirit, soul, and body be preserved blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, when he says, test all things, he doesn't mean for us to try everything out and decide whether it's good or bad. That's not the meaning of it. Test all things. He wants us to prove all things, King James says, or examine all things, New American Standard would say, examine everything carefully. How do we do that? Well, we do that with God's Word. Whatever it is, we come back to God's Word. Well, what does God say about that? Is that good? Is that bad? Should I involve myself in it? Should I abstain from that? Test all things by God's Word. Hold fast to what is good. The good things, go ahead and partake of those and participate in those, but abstain from the things that are evil. Don't go near the evil things. Well, that's what Lot did. He went right into the heart of the evil things that were going on. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and at verse 33, the Apostle Paul warns the Christians in Corinth, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits. The New American Standard reads this way, bad company corrupts good morals. Sometimes when we come across things like that, we might try to comfort ourselves by saying, well, he's actually talking about the really, really evil people. Don't hang around with really evil people. I wish I could say that he's talking about non-Christians who just are not interested in the things of God at all. Paul's actually warning the Corinthians against some of their own brethren. That's the nature of his warning there. Because there were some Christians in Corinth who were teaching false doctrines, who were teaching that there is no resurrection. That's the greater context of 1 Corinthians chapter 15. They denied the resurrection, and because they denied the resurrection, I think that contributed to the sinful nature of Corinth. You read through 1 Corinthians, and there's just sin after sin after sin after sin. Well, if there is no resurrection, then there is no judgment, right? And so I just go do whatever I want to do. Doesn't really matter. Paul warns those who are faithful, bad company corrupts good morals. Be careful about those that you keep company with. Now, if God is, through the Apostle Paul, warning Christians to be careful about the company of some other Christians, then how much more so for Lot to be careful about the company of those who are in the cities of the plains who are pagans, who do not believe in the God of heaven, and are immoral in their conduct. Again, no one is immune to the influence of evil. So we need to be careful about the company that we keep. We need to acknowledge that it's possible for us to be led astray. That takes some humility to admit I could be led astray. But if we go into a situation, arrogant, thinking, that could never happen to me. Again, as Paul said, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Hebrews chapter 3 at verse 12 beginning. The writer says, beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God, but exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. This is the writer warning Christians. Oh, well, that could never happen to me. Do you know what he does in the rest of the chapter? He uses the Exodus generation of Israel as an illustration. Here is a group of people that were led out of bondage in Egypt to go to the promised land. Moses is leading them. They're going to go to the promised land. Guess how many of them made it to the promised land? 2. 603,550 men, plus women and children, plus those who were above the age of serving in the army. 2. Joshua and Caleb. Beware lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. I won't depart from God. I'm sure that whole generation thought that way. And then they complained and complained and complained and disobeyed and disobeyed and disobeyed, and eventually died in the wilderness. We need to be careful where we pitch our tent. Don't pitch our tent close to evil. Consider an example through King Jehoshaphat. King Jehoshaphat was a good king in Judah, but he did something very foolish. He allied himself with King Ahab, who's the wicked king in the north in Israel, by marriage. 2 Chronicles chapter 18 and verse 1. He married Ahab's daughter. Now, why? We're not told in the text. I don't know if it was political expediency, if it was an effort at reunification, if it was to facilitate trade. We just simply don't know why, but it was the wrong decision. Because what he did is he pitched his tent close to Ahab, who is a wicked man. And eventually what happens is because of his association with Israel, he ends up going to war with Ahab. If if you're allied with somebody and they're going to go to war, well, you're expected to go to war with them, right? And so he goes to war against the Syrians along with Ahab, and had the Lord not delivered Jehoshaphat, he would have died on the battlefield. After the battle, the prophet Jehu rebukes the king. 2 Chronicles chapter 19, verse 2 and 3. He says this, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? He's talking about Ahab. Your father-in-law is wicked and he does not love God. Should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. And only by the mercy of God did Jehoshaphat not die. But what he did is he put himself and his family and his nation at risk through his allegiance to Ahab. Lot goes to the cities of the plain. He put himself, his family at risk because he pitched his tent close to those that are wicked. We need to be careful about the influence that the wicked have upon us. Well, eventually he moves right into the city of Sodom. There's other cities to move into, right? No, he chooses Sodom. Moves into the city of Sodom. No longer just pitching his tent near it, he's right there. Now again, as a shepherd, this doesn't make any sense. If you have a whole bunch of sheep and you have cattle, there's not a lot of fields inside the city. You want to be outside the city. You want to be out in the plains. That's what he originally chose, was the plains, but no, he's inside the city. And Sodom is not your normal run-of-the-mill city. Chapter 13 and verse 13 in Genesis, it is exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And so Sodom is not the kind of place where you would expect to find somebody who fears God and wants to serve God. And yet that is where we find Lot. This move to Sodom put his family in danger. Now here's the thing. We need to be selective about where we go, about what we do, about who we associate with. We need to be picky about those things. And not picky in the arrogant type sense, I'm greater than you are. That's not it. Picky in the sense that I need to protect my spiritual walk with the Lord and my family and my influence. And so there are certain places that I should not go, and there are certain things that I should not do, and there are certain people that it's just not good for me to be with them. And so we need to be very selective. Now again, we might convince ourselves that it won't affect us. But here's the thing. Typically, we will either be an influence for good or we will be influenced for bad. Very seldom does it just sort of stay status quo, that there's no influence one way or the other. So either we will be an influence for good upon those who are evil, and hopefully they'll come to know the truth, or they may be an influence on us and we'll step further away from truth. And so when we keep the wrong company, it will wear upon us and it will change us. Hang around people who are constantly cursing, and guess what starts to roll through your brain? Those words start to roll through your brain. And before too long, if you continue with that, not only do they roll through your brain, but they end up rolling off the tongue. That's the nature of influence. And so we need to be careful about influence. Now, Lot was not influenced to participate in the sexual wickedness of Sodom. But his time in the city of Sodom definitely had an influence on him and on his family. 2 Peter chapter 2 at verse 7 and 8. We're told that Lot was oppressed by the conduct of the wicked, for that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. So again, he didn't participate in it, he didn't approve of it, but he brought torment on himself every day. Lot gets up, he steps out his front door. Oh, these evil people. He sees it everywhere. He hears it everywhere. He is just surrounded by this. Now, it's great that he was righteous and that he continued to be righteous, continued to be focused on good things and right things. But do you know what a very good solution for this would be? Lot, go back to the field. Just leave the city. Go back to the field. His righteous soul being tormented day after day, he could do without the torment just simply by leaving Sodom behind. There's no good reason to be there. Now, one might argue, but if he hadn't gone into Sodom, then there wouldn't be any opportunity to influence them for good. And I understand that. I get that. Let me pose a question to that. Well, how'd that work out? Not very well, right? And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be around those who are of the world. Jesus was around those who are the world in order to influence them for good. He did not participate in their wickedness, but he was sent to save that which was lost. And you and I as Christians are sent to save that which is lost as well. And so we can't go and find ourselves a mountain retreat and we're going to be there and never leave there. That's not going to work. Yes, we need to be in the world, but not of the world. But here's a few things to consider about Lot's experience there. Yes, certainly the Lord wants us to seek opportunities to teach others, but at what point does the situation put my faith or my family's spiritual life in undue risk? We need to do an assessment on situations and whether or not it is going to be detrimental to our spiritual health and to our family's spiritual health. And so if the situation is going to be bad for my faith and my family's faith, then I need to be aware of that and I need to be cautious. In addition to that, at what point does an effort to teach the wicked become casting pearls before swine or giving what is holy to the dogs? Now, by all means, if we have the opportunity to talk to somebody about the Lord, then we do that. And every opportunity we have, go ahead and do that. But if they are persistently evil and they show absolutely no interest in the things that we're saying, then eventually it gets to the point where we are wasting our breath and we are putting out what is holy before those who have no respect for it whatsoever. Casting pearls before swine, giving what is holy to dogs. In Sodom, Lot went well beyond the point of undue risk to his family. And we're going to see that in just a bit. And I have no doubt he stayed longer with the men of Sodom than what it took them to display themselves as swine and dogs. But he continued. He just stayed. In addition to that, there's something to be said for timing and location as well. The best place to go and teach people is not to, let's go into the local bar where everybody's drunk and try and teach them about the Lord. That's not optimal. There are better locations and better times than that. Setting up a Bible study inside of a brothel is not going to accomplish a whole lot. There are better times and locations than that. Teaching what God says about homosexuality at a pride parade is going to anger a whole bunch of people, but it will not bring anybody to Christ. There are better times and locations than that. And so what Lot did is he put himself far from an optimal situation, and in return, he got less than optimal results. He didn't influence anybody in Sodom. Unfortunately, some of his family, all of his family, was influenced by Sodom. And so his stay in Sodom was disastrous for his family. Some of his family ended up losing their lives. So after he was warned by the angels that God's going to destroy the city and he needs to flee, he went to his sons-in-law and to his daughters. I don't know how many daughters were married off, at least 2, but he might have had more that were married off. And he warned them of what was to come. Verse 14, Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who had married his daughters and said, "Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city." But to his sons-in-law, he seemed to be joking. They didn't take it seriously. Well, why would they? They don't believe in God. That's a funny joke, Lot. All right, see ya. They had no clue about what was about to happen. They had no respect for Lot as a father-in-law to at least give him the benefit of the doubt. And so they laugh at it, and they stayed and died. And his daughters who were married to them as well stayed in the city, and they perished. Genesis 19 and verse 16, it tells us that Lot lingered. I'd never looked up the word lingered there in the Hebrew before, but looked it up in preparation for the lesson today. It's maha is the Hebrew word. To question or hesitate. To be reluctant. To delay, to linger, to stay oneself, to tarry. Lot has just been told the city is going to be destroyed. You need to get out. Get yourself and your loved ones out. And he goes to his sons-in-law and his daughters, and they're laughing about it. And so I understand the hesitation here, because he's going to have to leave those daughters behind. And that is uncomfortable. The reluctance to go, and it's at this point that the angels have to take him by the hand. He's not leaving. The angels actually grab him and his wife and his other two daughters in order to lead them out. He is absolutely distraught about losing some of his family. And why is he losing some of his family? Well, okay, it's because God's destroying Sodom. Well, why is God destroying Sodom? Well, it's because it's a wicked city. But the true question here is, Lot, why are you in Sodom in the first place? Why are you losing your daughters in Sodom? It's because you chose to move there. He pitched his tent as far as Sodom. So the angels take hold of Lot and his wife and his two daughters that are remaining with him. They lead them out of the city, command them, go and escape for your lives to the mountains. They are warned, do not look behind you. Don't look back. Flee to the mountains. And yet, you know what happened. Lot's wife, as they're on their way, Lot's wife turned back. And we don't know why. It's not clear why she looked back. It's never told to us. I don't know if it was out of curiosity to see what was going on behind her, or if it was out of pity and concern for their daughters that they just left behind, or if it was longing for the city itself because that had been home to her. Whatever it was disobedience to the Lord, and she was turned to a pillar of salt. But the tragedies that befell Lot and his family don't stop there. At least two daughters in the city dead. His wife turned to a pillar of salt out in the plain. But it keeps on going. It affected the sense of morality and innocence of the other two daughters. Lot finds himself a cave in the mountains, and he and his daughters flee to that cave. Genesis chapter 19, I'm just going to read a portion of text here, starting at verse 31, going down to verse 36. It says, "Now the firstborn said to the younger, Our father is old, and there is no man on the earth to come into us, as is the custom of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. So they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in and lay with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. It happened on the next day that the firstborn said to the younger, indeed, I lay with my father last night. Let us make him drink wine tonight also, and you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve the lineage of our father. Then they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down or when she arose. Thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. They got their father drunk 2 nights in a row so that they could go and lay with him. Where did they learn that kind of conduct? I don't think they learned that when they were sojourning with Uncle Abram. They certainly did not learn that from God and from his direction. Where did they learn that? I can't help but think some time in Sodom corrupted their innocence. Now, they explain it that, we're preserving the lineage of our father. Maybe Lot needed to explain to them, not every man in the world is evil, like what was going on down in the cities of the plain. And not every man is being destroyed either. It's almost like they think there's no man left for them. There are men in other cities. But again, I wonder if the sexual immorality of Sodom influenced these young women to not have a proper concept of fidelity and an understanding of marriage and of intimacy and of sexuality. That's what wickedness does. It corrupts the mind. And these girls had corrupt minds. They had lost their innocence. And so Lot's decision to pitch his tent even as far as Sodom was catastrophic for his family, for their livelihood and for their faith. He comes out of there. He actually has nothing now. He's gone down to Sodom. He had all kinds of things, and the idea was prosperity, going to make even more. And here he is. He has lost over half of his family, and he's destitute. He has nothing. And his faith is nowhere near where it was back at the beginning of chapter 13. There's no way that it can be. In fact, we even see him disobeying God when fleeing. He's told to flee into the mountains. He argues to go to a city. He's got so used to the cities and wanting to be in the cities, he argues to go to the city of Zoar. Then when he gets there, he's afraid. And so he finally decides to do what God said. Flees off to the mountains. This did not work out well for Lot and his family. So friends, we need to be careful not to pitch our tents towards Sodom. We need to stay away from any and all forms of wickedness, because wickedness brings about destruction. And wickedness affects and infects those who are around it. And so the Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians 6, and at verse 18, he says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside of the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Lot was surrounded by sexual immorality, and it affected his family. We live in a culture that accepts sexual immorality, even glories in it. We need to stand for sexual purity. Again, the Apostle Paul writes this, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 14, my beloved, flee from idolatry. Lot was surrounded by pagans. Everybody around him did not believe in the one true God and the Creator. More and more, our society is seeking to erase God. And when God is removed, people will find something else to exalt, something else to worship, something else to serve. So we need to stand firm in our faith. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6 through 11. Paul says, now godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. But you, O man of God, flee these things and pursue righteousness and godliness, faith, love, patience, and gentleness. Lot's decision to go down to the plain of Jordan was based on prosperity. It backfired. That is not what happened. Paul warns against the pursuit of wealth. The love of money is the root of all evil, all kinds of evil. Some have strayed from the faith in their pursuit of it, in their greediness. Success in our culture is often judged by how much you accumulate. That's not how God looks at success. We need to learn contentment. We need to be thankful for what we have and not fall into the snare that surrounds us in this world. Finally, 2 Timothy 2, verse 22, flee also youthful lust, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. I wonder if the lights of the city were a draw to Lot and his family. The novelty of it, the excitement of it, or as Paul refers to it, youthful lusts. Those things that, young people just get excited about stuff like that. I wonder if that is what drew him there. We need to be careful not to be drawn in by things that appeal to our desires, to the carnal nature, because it's going to draw us away from God. And Lot is an example. That's exactly what happened. Peter cautioned us to abstain from the fleshly lusts that war against the soul. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. I wonder if Lot had it all to do over again. Wouldn't that be great if we got do-overs in life? Right? There's some things I would do over and do differently. I think we all have those things that we would change. But if Lot had it all to do over again, knowing what would happen, you know where Lot would have found himself? Walking around in the mountains of Canaan. Assuming Lot to be a righteous individual, which again, Peter told us, righteous Lot tormented his soul there in Sodom. If he knew what was to come, if he could see the outcome of all of this, he would never have acted selfishly on that occasion when Abraham told him, you go ahead and choose which way you want to go, and I'll go the opposite. He would have chosen the rugged and rough terrain of Canaan, which would keep his family away from the wickedness that was in the cities and the plains. Unfortunately, we don't get a do-over. Lot did not. And this led his family completely away from God. You follow down through these children that come out of his children. We're not talking about God-fearing nations that end up resulting from that. That's not what happened. And so we need to learn from his mistakes and not make the same kind of mistakes in our lives and for our families. We need to be careful where we pitch our tent. Do not pitch our tent close to Sodom. Do not pitch it close to wickedness, but stay as close as we can to the Lord our God.